In a live Supreme Court ethics hearing, Chief Justice Clarence Thomas interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence. His voice thundered. But her response? Ice-cold, unshaken, and laced with fire. Should we talk about your billionaire-funded vacations or judicial integrity? The room froze. Cameras rolled. And in that moment, the most powerful judge in America stood utterly exposed. What happened next shocked the nation. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The Supreme Court chamber feels less like a court and more like a fault line about to split. Cameras hum. Reporters lean over laptops. 9 black robes stare from the bench. At the witness table sits Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, hands steady on her binder, testifying about judicial transparency and the corrosive effect of dark money on the court's legitimacy. She cites numbers, precedents, patterns. She notes how public confidence has cratered to historic lows, how undisclosed gifts and unreported flights hollow the Constitution from inside its own marble shell. Every sentence is measured, prosecutorial, precise. Then, mid-thought, a voice rolls across the room. Low, impatient, unmistakable. Congresswoman, Chief Justice Clarence Thomas says, leaning toward his microphone. We have endured decades of political theater in this building. Before you lecture the court, perhaps you should clarify your qualifications. A few conservative members shift in their seats, smirking. The rest of the room holds its breath, unsure whether to look down or straight at her. Jasmine Crockett doesn't blink. She adjusts the mic, folds one page closed, and answers in the same steady register she began with. Respectfully, Justice Thomas, should we talk about your undisclosed luxury trips or shall I continue? The air changes. Pens stop. A clerk's hand freezes above a keyboard. Somewhere a producer whispers, "Clip that." The hashtag is born before the Chief Justice exhales. Phones vibrate in pockets all across America as the live stream surges. The hearing, meant to restore trust, has just detonated it. Thomas stares. Crockett waits. And a nation asks itself a question no ethics code can dodge. If power won't police itself, who will? Outside, protesters on both sides raise signs, but inside the court, the loudest thing is the silence after her question. A silence that sounds like the start of accountability. At last, maybe. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in Washington as a brand, a slogan, or a headline chaser. She arrived as a lawyer who had already spent years in real courtrooms, standing between the state and the people it tried to steamroll. In Dallas, she built her name case by case, protecting protesters when it wasn't popular, defending families when the system tried to make them disappear, and forcing institutions to answer questions they'd rather bury in sealed files and closed chambers. She learned fast that power rarely apologizes. It has to be cornered, documented, and confronted. Her origin story isn't wrapped in ivy and Latin mottos. It's written in affidavits, depositions, and nights spent rereading transcripts until the sun rose. She grew up in St. Louis, where the conversation about justice was never theoretical, it was survival. By the time she took her oath in Congress, she had already fought the fights that make most politicians flinch. So when the country began to look at the Supreme Court, not for legal brilliance, but for the basic honesty of its members, Gretchen didn't flinch either. She pivoted. She became not just a legislator, but a watchdog. Her style is what unnerves the powerful. She doesn't grandstand. She underlines. She footnotes. She asks questions that come with their own exhibits attached. In hearing rooms, she lets her opponents talk themselves into corners, then quietly closes the door. That discipline, that refusal to be baited into empty theater, is what brought her to a nationally televised confrontation with the most insulated man in American law, Justice Clarence Thomas. The threats didn't move her. The whispers didn't stop her. When colleagues told her to let it go for the sake of stability, she asked them a simple question. Whose stability are we protecting? Theirs or the people's? That is the line Jasmine Crockett draws every time. When she walked into that ethics hearing, she was there for a viral clip. She was there to make sure the word ethics still meant something. And when Clarence Thomas tried to challenge her credibility in front of the country, she did what she has always done. She answered with facts, not fear. For years, Clarence Thomas was the quiet spine of the conservative legal movement, barely speaking during oral arguments, authoring opinions steeped in originalism. He cultivated the image of a stoic, unflappable jurist, unmoved by public pressure. Conservatives revered him as a philosophical anchor. Liberals saw him as an immovable obstacle. But both sides, for a long time, treated his reputation as judicially untouchable. Then the receipts started surfacing. Reports of undisclosed luxury trips, private jet flights, yacht excursions, real estate deals, all connected to wealthy political donors who had business before the court or deep interest in its outcomes. The image of Clarence Thomas as the uncorrupted constitutional purist began to fracture under the weight of something worse than ideology, entitlement. He didn't just enjoy access, he denied the public the right to know about it. His defenders said it was legal. His critics said it was corrupt. He said nothing until the pressure mounted. Then his tone shifted from silence to defiance. He insisted the rules were unclear. He insisted he was targeted. He insisted his integrity was intact. But every time another undisclosed gift came to light, the question grew louder. How can the highest court in the land demand respect when its own members refuse accountability? That's the environment Jasmine Crockett walked into. A justice with a crumbling public image, a court with record-low approval, a country wondering whether ethics laws apply to the robed elite. When Thomas cut her off, when he tried to diminish her in real time from the bench, he wasn't just defending himself. He was defending a system that had never expected to be challenged so directly by someone who did her homework and refused to be intimidated by a title. Clarence Thomas's legacy now stands at a crossroads. One path leads to the history books as the jurist who survived every scandal through stubbornness and loyal movement that covered his blind spots. The other path ends with a reckoning, forced not by Congress as an institution, but by the people represented by figures like Jasmine Crockett, who finally said out loud what millions were thinking. If public trust is the court's only currency, then undisclosed luxury is a debt the country will not forgive. And for the first time, in that chamber, in front of the cameras, Clarence Thomas had to face a truth he could not filibuster with silence. The chamber was packed wall to wall, the kind of packed that made even seasoned staffers sit a little straighter. Marble, mahogany, velvet rope, solemn tradition dressed up for a reckoning. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat before the dais, binder thick, tabs color-coded, eyes locked on the committee chair. Behind her, rows of reporters leaned forward, ready to pounce on the first rupture of decorum. This wasn't performative oversight. It felt like an audit of the court itself. Crockett didn't warm up. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm entering into the record a set of exhibits detailing undisclosed luxury travel, private jet use, real estate transfers, and donor-funded hospitality accepted by Justice Clarence Thomas over the course of more than 20 years. She slid the first packet to the clerk, then clicked a remote. A screen lit up with a manifest. Exhibit A, a 2018 yacht itinerary in the Aegean. The benefactor, billionaire Harlan Crow. Estimated market value, 6 figures. Not disclosed on Justice Thomas's federal forms. A ripple of sound moved through the gallery. Crockett kept going. Exhibit B, 2019. Private flights to Indonesia. Again, undisclosed. Exhibit C, a property acquisition in Savannah involving Justice Thomas's mother's home, purchased by the same benefactor, subsequently renovated, taxes paid. Exhibit D, internal correspondence referencing preferred access to chambers from a donor-connected intermediary. That is not just ethically dubious. It raises questions about conflicts of interest that implicate the integrity of case selection itself. On the bench, Clarence Thomas shifted, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. He was used to headlines. He was not used to evidentiary sequencing, laid out like a prosecutor building a charge sheet. The other justices went still. One glanced sideways. Another stared forward as if studying a distant horizon. Crockett's tone never rose. The Supreme Court of the United States asks the public to trust it unconditionally because it has no binding ethics code, no independent enforcement mechanism, and no transparent recusal standard. We are told that tradition will suffice. But traditions don't file disclosure forms. Traditions don't recuse when a billionaire pays your bills. Traditions don't fix a crisis of credibility. Law does. Rules do. Enforcement does. She paused, then lifted a final page. Here is a memo from a former judicial employee noting, quote, heightened sensitivity around donor-related travel, end quote. That's awareness. That's knowledge. That's not an oversight. Thomas's jaw tightened. His pen clicked once, then stilled. Jasmine noticed. Everyone noticed. This isn't partisan, she said, eyes sweeping the room, landing briefly on him. This is structural. The question is simple. Can a justice accept undisclosed luxury benefits from individuals with ideological and financial interests before the court and still claim impartiality? Silence. Cameras zoomed. A producer mouthed, roll on her. Stay on her. Crockett leaned in. The court's legitimacy is not an inheritance. It's a practice. And if the justices won't protect it, Congress must. For the first time, Clarence Thomas shifted forward, hand moving toward the mic. The interruption was coming, and Jasmine Crockett, already turning to the next tab in her binder, looked ready for it. Justice Clarence Thomas's voice cracked through the silence, like a gavel on marble. Congresswoman Crockett, he interrupted, low and deliberate. This hearing is on judicial ethics, not political performance. Let's not mistake spectacle for substance. The room froze. A Chief Justice breaking his typical silence wasn't just rare, it was seismic. Journalists sat upright. Staffers glanced at one another. The other justices didn't flinch, but their eyes gave them away. Crockett didn't move. She simply closed the binder. With respect, Justice Thomas, she said. The substance is precisely the point. The fact that these disclosures, or lack thereof, have become national news is not a political failure. It is an ethical one. Yours. Thomas pressed forward. I've served this country longer than you've been in public office. I know what it means to hold this institution together under pressure. This line of questioning suggests impropriety without recognizing service. Crockett responded, unshaken. And I've served clients who were railroaded by systems held together by silence. Respectfully, tenure does not equal immunity. You say I'm performing? The only performance that matters is the one behind closed doors, where trips are taken, favors traded, and disclosures forgotten. The air got thick. Thomas leaned back slightly, but his stare never dropped. You're speaking to a branch that's co-equal, Congresswoman, not subordinate. I advise you to consider your tone. Crockett didn't blink. Then I advise you to consider your paperwork. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Anderson Cooper, seated in the moderator's corner, barely masked a stunned expression. A producer on the floor held up a note. Stay on this. Don't cut. Justice Sonia Sotomayor glanced down and away. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson froze in a pose of judicial neutrality, but her jaw clenched slightly. On the other end of the bench, Justice Alito glanced at Thomas with a subtle shake of his head. Crockett continued. This is not theater. This is your record. This is the law you swore to uphold. And every one of us, lawyers, citizens, lawmakers, has the right to question whether you still do. Thomas tapped a pen against his notes. He didn't speak again, but his eyes betrayed the impact. Not rage, not even outrage. Recognition. The confrontation had changed tone. This was no longer about questions. It was about truths too long unspoken, and Crockett had just said the quiet part loud. The silence that followed was unlike any heard in the halls of American justice. For a few seconds, the Supreme Court chamber, normally governed by procedural decorum, was suspended in electric tension. Every camera, every reporter, every heartbeat in the room hung on what would come next. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took a breath. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The law, she said slowly, her voice unwavering, cannot be blind if its judges keep looking the other way. For profit. The words dropped like a hammer. Audible gasps rippled across the chamber. Even the stenographer's fingers paused momentarily before catching up. Clarence Thomas blinked, once. Then again. His jaw tightened, but he remained still. Crockett let the moment breathe. Then, with the weight of both evidence and lived experience behind her, she opened a file. "This is not conjecture," she continued. "This is a log of luxury gifts, flights on private jets, vacations to resorts owned by billionaires with active cases before this court. Undisclosed. Hidden. And now, public." She handed the binder to a clerk who moved it toward the bench. "We don't demand perfection from our judges," Crockett said. "But we do expect disclosure. We do expect accountability. And when trust erodes at the highest court, democracy is not far behind." Thomas shifted in his seat, lips pressed into a line. He didn't respond. Not a word. Justice Elena Kagan quietly placed a hand over her notes, looking forward but visibly rattled. Justice Roberts, seated beside Thomas, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the desk, as if retreating into neutrality. In the gallery, reporters scrambled to tweet, dictate, and record. CNN cut to a live ticker. MSNBC ran a chyron in real time. Breaking. Chronic conference. Clarence Thomas on ethics. The law can't be blind. Crockett's eyes scanned the bench. What we witnessed here today is not disrespect. It is reckoning, and it is long overdue. The final blow wasn't shouted. It was delivered like a closing argument, measured, focused, undeniable. The clip went viral before she even finished her sentence. 30 million views in under 24 hours. Political analysts called it the most consequential testimony since Watergate. Because in a single sentence, Crockett hadn't just called out Clarence Thomas. She had spoken for an entire country tired of justice with a price tag. By 9:17 a.m., Jasmine Crockett's office uploaded a 98-page ethics dossier to a public-facing congressional server with a single line of cover text. The appearance of justice requires the reality of accountability. No press conference, no theatrics, just receipts. The document was clinical, almost prosecutorial. Appendix A, chart of flight logs tied to a billionaire donor's Gulfstream with Clarence Thomas listed as guest, denoting 6 trips over 8 years, none disclosed. Appendix B, resort invoices from Montana, Bali, and the Adirondacks, all comped, all omitted from financial reports. Appendix C, a chain of emails between a Thomas staffer and 2 dark money nonprofits coordinating honoraria adjacent payments, fees routed through a 501(b) that never appeared on any judicial disclosure. Appendix D, a sealed internal memo from a former court employee dated 26 months earlier, urging a preliminary review of repeatedly unreported gifts, travel, and in-kind benefits. The memo was quietly stamped, "No further action." Then came the spreadsheets, cross-referenced timelines matching major court opinions with donor-hosted retreats, donor-funded flights, donor-arranged educational seminars. The overlap weren't subtle. One chart, color-coded and chilling in its simplicity, showed opinion drafts circulating the same week a luxury lakehouse stay was arranged by an allied political foundation. Another showed private jet manifests within 48 hours of a politically consequential ruling, complete with passenger initials that matched known benefactors. Reporters didn't know where to start. Legal ethics scholars flooded television studios and podcasts, sounding less like commentators and more like emergency physicians. "This isn't a disclosure error," one former federal judge said on air. "This is a systemic breach of public trust." The American Bar Association's Ethics Committee issued a rare late-afternoon statement calling the dossier substantive and troubling. Several state bar leaders followed within hours, urging Congress to act where the court refuses to police itself. Even conservative media couldn't wave it away. Fox News cautiously framed it as a transparency dispute, but their legal contributors admitted on air that the documents were extremely difficult to reconcile with existing disclosure rules. A Wall Street Journal op. Inside the court, the scramble started. A terse statement from the marshal's office insisted the justices take compliance seriously, while Thomas's chambers circulated background quotes about bad-faith smears. But those lines read hollow against time-stamped itineraries, unredacted invoices, and internal correspondences Crockett had already placed in the record. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't tweet victory lap threads. She went back to committee, sat straight-backed, and waited for the next hearing notice. When a reporter finally caught her in a hallway and asked if this was about taking down Clarence Thomas, she didn't blink. "This is about rebuilding a court the public can trust," she said. "If you wear the robe, you wear the burden." By evening, congressional inboxes were on fire. Constituents who had never watched a Supreme Court argument in their lives wrote with a clarity that cut through all the legal jargon. "If judges can accept gifts in secret, why should we believe any ruling is fair?" Pollsters saw a dip in institutional trust within 48 hours. The paper trail did what Crockett intended. It shifted the debate from personalities to proof, from punditry to policy. And for the first time in decades, the question wasn't whether the court should police itself, it was whether Congress would finally force it to. 2 days after Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett released the ethics dossier, a rumble shook the marble halls of the U.S. Supreme Court. Not from protesters or press, but from within the institution itself. Justice Sonia Sotomayor issued a rare public statement. "The public's confidence in the judiciary is not a luxury. It is the foundation of our legitimacy. Where there is erosion, there must be repair." Without naming Clarence Thomas, the message was unmistakable. Hours later, Justice Elena Kagan followed, expressing support for immediate ethics guidelines that reflect the gravity of our position and the expectations of a modern democracy. These statements marked the first time in recent history that sitting justices openly distanced themselves from one of their own. The American people noticed. News outlets plastered the statements across headlines: "Justices break ranks, Supreme Court schism, Crockett's dossier sparks judicial reckoning." CNN held a special panel. Legal commentators, liberal and conservative alike, agreed. Bar associations across the country responded in a wave. New York's Bar Association called for a formal investigation. The Texas Bar issued an urgent ethics review. California's Judicial Council drafted a public letter demanding uniform disclosure and conflict of interest rules for all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. For once, the legal profession wasn't hedging, it was mobilizing. Public trust numbers nosedagger. A new poll from Gallup showed trust in the Supreme Court dropped from 42% to 28% in less than a week. Among independents, the collapse was even steeper. Editorials in swing state newspapers, the Arizona Republic, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Philadelphia Inquirer, demanded reforms. The phrase, "unethical Supreme Court," trended nationally. Inside the Capitol, the effect was immediate. Moderate Democrats who once feared touching judicial ethics now called for reform legislation. Republicans, quartered by the clarity of the dossier, began avoiding questions on the issue entirely. One GOP senator, anonymously quoted, confessed to reporters, "We can't defend this and keep a straight face." Justice Thomas himself remained silent, but his absence from public view spoke volumes. Rumors swirled of emergency meetings among the justices. Chief Justice John Roberts reportedly attempted private damage control, asking colleagues to pervert the court's dignity. But the court's dignity wasn't just in peril, it was hemorrhaging. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett returned to the House Judiciary Committee with calm determination. She didn't mention Thomas by name. Instead, she delivered a short statement. Ethics is not optional. Accountability is not a smear campaign. And silence does not protect credibility. It destroys it. Even before she sat down, applause broke out. Not from fellow members, but from a packed gallery of citizens who had shown up in person, some with homemade signs. "The court is not above us," and "Thank you, Rocket." By week's end, every justice had been asked to respond to the revelations. Only 2 had. But the silence from the rest was no longer perceived as dignity. It was seen as complicity. The court, once perceived as untouchable, had developed visible cracks, and Jasmine Crockett had not just exposed them. She had made the American public stare straight into them. The day after Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan's public statements, Pop Seaton shifted from quiet dismay to organized action. By 9:00 a.m., the Speaker of the House convened a bipartisan emergency meeting on judicial ethics reform. What had started as a single ethics hearing had snowballed into a constitutional reckoning. Members from both parties, some reluctantly, followed into the chamber, knowing they could no longer ignore the storm. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked in with the 98-page dossier in one hand and a folder marked Bipartisan Ethics Commission Proposal in the other. She wasn't there to grandstand. She was there to legislate. The room buzzed as her staff distributed packets containing proposed oversight reforms, financial disclosures, recusals, travel transparency, and post-retirement lobbying bans. For a moment, there was unity. Not around ideology, but around the uncomfortable truth that no branch of government should be immune from accountability. Within 48 hours, the House Ethics Committee voted unanimously to initiate a formal investigation into judicial conduct, the first of its kind in nearly 5 decades. CC and viewership spiked. Town halls lit up with voters demanding answers. Even Fox News was forced to cover it in prime time, with one anchor admitting, "Congresswoman Crockett has touched a national nerve." In the Senate, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer issued a statement supporting permanent legislative measures to restore faith in the judiciary. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell remained silent, his office refusing press inquiries. Behind the scenes, staffers scrambled to review judicial gift history and potential conflicts across multiple justices, fearing this was only the beginning. Then came Crockett's address on the House floor. She wore white in honor of the suffragettes and spoke with the clarity of a former courtroom litigator and the fury of a woman who had spent her career watching justice favor the powerful. "This is not just about one man," she declared. "This is about every young black lawyer who was told they didn't belong. This is about every working-class American who was told their voice didn't matter in the chambers of power." The chamber held its breath as she continued. "It is about the soul of our democracy, about whether justice is truly blind or just bought." Applause erupted. Not polite or performative, but real, rolling, thunderous. It echoed through the marble corridors of the Capitol and spilled out onto the National Mall, where protesters stood glued to screens, some with tears in their eyes. Overnight, the clip of her speech hit 30 million views across platforms. Hashtags exploded. Judicial. Reform. Now. Justice for all. Crockett delivers. For once, it wasn't a scandal dominating the discourse. It was a demand for integrity. The House passed a resolution calling for a bipartisan commission to draft binding judicial ethics guidelines within 90 days. It wasn't the final step, but it was the first real one in decades. Across the country, citizens who once viewed the Supreme Court as distant and untouchable now saw it as flawed and fixable. And at the center of that movement stood Jasmine Crockett, not as a firebrand, but as a constitutional surgeon wielding truth like a scalpel and exposing the infection long ignored. The system hadn't healed yet, but it had been awakened. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's closing line ricocheting through the Supreme Court chamber, the internet detonates. The 17-second clip, her voice steady, her phrasing surgical, gets ripped, reposted, captioned, memed, scored with orchestral drops, and stitched alongside decades of headlines about undisclosed trips, relatively hospitality, and a court that tells Americans to trust it while refusing to police itself. Thomas exposed rockets to the top of X worldwide. By midnight, "Fix the Court," "Judicial Reform Now," and "Crockett Said It" are trending simultaneously. Tip-top law professors break down the ethics code federal judges must follow and the one Supreme Court justices never bound themselves to. YouTube creators push out hour-long explainers titled "How We Got Here" and "Why Jasmine Crockett's Line Could Change the Court Forever." Instagram carousels circulate with plain language summaries of every undisclosed gift, private jet, resort stay, and debt forgiveness tied to the justice. Snapchat, usually allergic to long-form politics, features the moment on its Discover page under the line "Hurt Around the Court." Late-night comedy goes full prosecution. Justice Thomas tried to object, one host cracks, but Crockett overruled, with evidence. The audience laughs, then quiets as the show runs a side-by-side graphic. Crockett's quote on one side, judicial canons of ethics on the other. The punchline lands harder than the joke. One of them is accountable. One of them isn't. Cable news panels scramble to reshuffle rundowns. Legal ethicists who once spoke in cautious footnotes start speaking plainly. Former clerks, some still loyal, some quietly furious, text producers off the record. She said what everyone in chambers whispers. Editorial boards weigh in. This is not about partisanship, one reads. It's about whether the rule of law can survive when its guardians dismiss. Donations to watchdog and reform groups surge. Nonprofits that have pleaded for years for a binding Supreme Court ethics code suddenly see record-breaking small-dollar contributions. Young voters turn sign-ups into signatures. Law students turn outrage into organizing calls. 3L posts, "I'm applying to clerkships but not for judges who think ethics are optional." The post gets 400,000 likes. Teachers assign the hearing in civics class. Pastors quote Crockett from the pulpit. Union holds play the clip before meetings. A conservative podcast host, usually hostile to court bashing, concedes on air. If these facts are real, this isn't a left-right problem. This is a rule of law problem. And somewhere between the viral edits and the sober editorials, something shifts. The mystique of judicial untouchability, carefully cultivated for generations, cracks in public view. For the first time in decades, millions of Americans aren't just asking what the court decided. They're asking who pays for the justices' decisions to be made in the shadows, and why no one made them answer before Jasmine Crockett did. Morning after the hearing, university campuses across the country are buzzing. At Howard, Berkeley, NYU, and even Harvard, law students gather on quads and in auditoriums not to debate theory, but to organize. Crockett's name is on everyone's lips, not as a politician, but as a symbol of resistance to judicial opacity. Its lawyers go up, lawyers for accountability, only receipts. A new student coalition forms overnight, Lawyers for Accountability, in Washington. By week's end, it has chapters in 47 law schools. Professors shift syllabi mid-semester. Civil procedure and constitutional law classes now open, with Crockett's testimony as a case study in institutional challenge and evidentiary framing. This isn't just advocacy, says one Yale lecturer. It's what courtroom power looks like when wielded by someone not blinded by prestige. Civic groups take note. The League of Women Voters, the Brennan Center, and the ACLG roll out joint campaigns pushing for enforceable Supreme Court ethics codes. Public petitions gain traction with hundreds of thousands of signatures demanding transparency and term limits. Polls reveal a majority of Americans, including Republicans, now believe judicial reform should be a top 3 national issue. The once unthinkable becomes tangible. Systemic change. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett becomes the unexpected face of a new judicial accountability movement. Invitations flood in, town halls, legal panels, college commencements. She declines most, choosing instead to meet with young organizers, law clerks, and survivors of unjust rulings. She releases a short video. This isn't about Clarence Thomas. It's about a culture of impunity. And I'm not done. Her video reaches 14 million viewers in 2 days. Cable news runs retrospectives on Crockett's career, labeling her the People's Counsel. Civil rights legends call her a torchbearer for the next generation. Political strategists whisper that she could be a contender for statewide office. Or more. But Crockett resists the spotlight. She tells one reporter, "I didn't take him down. I just told the truth out loud, with evidence. The real story is who's picking it up and running with it now." And they are. From courthouse steps to Capitol Hill, a wave begins. Not in her name, but because of her example. A movement grounded not in partisanship, but in principle. Jasmine Crockett sat under the glow of a single light, the marble hearing chamber quiet around her. After days of scrutiny, testimony, and confrontation, she was given the final word, and this time she was speaking to the nation. "This isn't personal," she began, her voice low but unshaken. "This is principled. When the law becomes a tool for the powerful alone, it ceases to be law. It becomes theater. And when the judges who interpret that law refuse to be held to it themselves, the very foundation of justice begins to rot." She paused for a moment, letting the silence land heavy. "I came here not to destroy one man," she continued. I came to expose a system that treats ethics like a suggestion and accountability like a threat. A system where billionaires fly justices around the world while everyday Americans beg for due process. That's not justice. That's power protecting itself. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on the camera. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum. If we can't agree that no one, not even a Supreme Court justice, should be above transparency, then we've already surrendered our democracy. This isn't about left or right. It's about right or wrong. Then she made it personal. My law degree didn't come with donors or yachts. It came with debt, with discipline, with a deep belief that the law could still mean something. That belief has been tested, but not broken. Her voice hardened. Every American should know this. You are not powerless. You are not voiceless. Whether you vote, organize, speak out, or simply stay informed, you are participating in a system that still bends, but only if we push. She stood, closing with clarity. So push. Demand ethics. Demand accountability. Demand better. And as the screen faded to black, her final words echoed. Subscribe. Share. Stay awake. Because justice doesn't just live in courtrooms. It lives wherever we choose to defend it.